In this city, wealth does more than merely unlock doors. It possesses them. For the past 30 years, Alexander Caldwell has transformed the concept of justice into a mere marketplace where innocence holds no value and guilt is merely a figure on a check. His signature has adorned the bottom of every unscrupulous transaction, and his influence has tainted every institution, turning his name into a hushed caution among those in power. It was said that crossing was akin to defying fate itself, an unavoidable ruin draped in designer suits and hidden offshore accounts. Yet, fate never encountered Judge Anthony Carter, a figure renowned as the last bastion of honesty within a corrupt system. This judge stands unyielding against threats, bribes, or attempts to break him. He emerged from the unforgiving streets of Chicago, rising to become the worst nightmare for corruption. Over 3 decades on the bench, he has never wavered, never turned a blind eye, and has always remembered the true cost of justice when one refuses to sell it. As Carter's gavel sliced through the artificial silence of courtroom 237, 2 formidable forces were on the brink of collision. Caldwell was convinced that his wealth could obliterate any truth, while Carter understood that some truths cannot be extinguished. They can only be postponed, and justice has lingered long enough. Before we delve back into proceedings, I would love to know where you're tuning in from today. If you're enjoying these narratives, ensure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you certainly won't want to miss. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of courtroom 237, casting elongated shadows across the polished wooden benches. Judge Anthony Carter stood before his mirror in his chambers, meticulously adjusting his black robes with practiced precision. His dark fingers smoothed the fabric as his thoughts drifted to the challenging day that lay ahead. After 2 decades on the bench, he had earned a reputation for his unwavering integrity. However, cases like the one he faced today always tested the limits of justice. "Your Honor," his clerk, Sarah Mitchell, knocked gently. "They are ready for you." Anthony nodded, taking one last glance in the mirror. The reflection that stared back revealed the weathered determination of a man who had fought his way up from nothing. Growing up in the south side of Chicago, he had witnessed his mother work 3 jobs to fund his law school education. Every sacrifice and every hurdle surmounted had led him to this moment. Another day dedicated to the pursuit of justice. He murmured as he followed Sarah into the corridor, where the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Today's case had captured national attention. Alexander Caldwell, the CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, faced serious charges, including tax fraud, embezzlement, and offshore money laundering. The magnitude of his alleged misdeeds was staggering, with millions drained from pension funds and community development projects. Assistant District Attorney Elena Cruz occupied the prosecution table, her dark hair tightly pulled back in a severe bun. She had spent months meticulously building this case, fully aware that the odds were stacked against her. Caldwell's actions had devastated vulnerable communities, leaving retired teachers and factory workers struggling to survive while he indulged in luxury. The defense table, in stark contrast, remained conspicuously empty. Judge Carter glanced at his watch, 9:15 a.m. Caldwell was already 15 minutes late. At 9:27, the courtroom door swung open and Alexander Caldwell sauntered in, phone pressed to his ear, his designer suit impeccably tailored to fit his tall frame. His silver hair shimmered under the fluorescent lights, and his tanned face displayed the smug expression of a man accustomed to buying his way out of trouble. "Yes, buy the shares now," he spoke into his phone, disregarding the disapproving looks from those around him. "I don't care about market predictions. Just do it." "All rise for the Honorable Judge Anthony Carter," the bailiff announced. The entire courtroom stood, except for Caldwell, who continued his phone conversation while lounging casually in his chair. A collective gasp rippled to the gallery, and even Caldwell's attorney, Victoria Holt, appeared uncomfortable, tugging at her client's sleeve. Judge Carter's face remained impassive as he took his seat. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had faced far worse than entitled billionaires. "Mr. Caldwell," he stated, his tone measured, "in this courtroom, we adhere to certain protocols. One of those is standing when the judge enters. Another is refraining from phone calls during proceedings." Caldwell finally ended his call but remained seated, fixing Carter with a look of barely concealed disdain. "My apologies, Your Honor," he drawled, making the title sound like an insult. "I was attending to some rather important business matters." "More important than showing respect for this court?" Carter replied. Caldwell smirked. "Well, that depends on one's perspective, doesn't it?" The gallery fell silent as Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Caldwell's. "Let me adjust your perspective, Mr. Caldwell. You are facing federal charges that could imprison you for 30 years. Your business matters can wait." For a long moment, Caldwell did not move, the tension in the courtroom thick enough to slice with a knife. Finally, with deliberate slowness, he rose to his feet. "Thank you," Carter said. "You may be seated. Now, let us proceed with the arraignment." As Elena Cruz began outlining the charges, a court officer quietly approached the bench, slipping Judge Carter a folded note. He read it discreetly. Watch your back. Caldwell owns half the police department. Evidence has a way of disappearing in his cases. Carter's expression remained unchanged as he tucked the note into his robes. He had suspected as much. Detective James Whitman, the police chief handling evidence in this case, had a reputation for being easily swayed. However, suspicions were not proof, and Carter understood the necessity of proceeding with caution. The morning unfolded with a series of legal motions. Victoria Holt, clad in an expensive charcoal suit, argued skillfully for dismissal based on procedural grounds. Cruz countered with passionate precision, detailing the devastating effects of Caldwell's schemes on local communities. During a brief recess, Carter observed through his chamber windows as reporters swarmed around Caldwell on the courthouse steps. The businessman played to the cameras with practiced ease. This is a witch hunt, Caldwell declared, flashing his perfect white teeth. Judge Carter clearly has an agenda. I've faced tougher judges than him, and I'm still here. The truth will prevail. Several news channels began airing segments debating judicial bias, with some pundits praising Carter's restraint in managing Caldwell's disrespect, while others questioned whether a judge from his background could truly be impartial in a case involving a wealthy white defendant. Back in his chambers, Elena Cruz knocked on Carter's door, her face drawn with concern. Your Honor, do you have a moment? He gestured for her to enter. What troubles you, counselor? Our key witness, the whistleblower from Caldwell's accounting department, she said, closing the door behind her. They're getting cold feet. Someone's been following them, taking photos of their children at school. The police say there's nothing they can do. Carter's jaw tightened. Of course they do. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Miss Cruz, this case will test everything we believe about justice. Caldwell doesn't merely break laws. He believes they don't apply to him. Individuals like that are dangerous precisely because they think their wealth elevates them above the system. How do we combat that? Elena asked, frustration evident in her voice. One step at a time, Carter replied. Build your case methodically. Document everything. Trust no one outside your immediate team, and remember that men like Caldwell often sow the seeds of their own downfall through their arrogance. As Elena left, Carter found himself reflecting on his own journey to the bench. He recalled his first case as a public defender, representing a young black man wrongfully accused of robbery. The evidence proving his innocence had mysteriously vanished from the police station. That case had imparted hard lessons about justice and power, lessons that would serve him well now. The afternoon session brought more of Caldwell's subtle defiance. He answered questions with barely concealed contempt, his responses dripping with condescension. Yet Carter noticed something beneath the arrogant facade. Flickers of unease when certain documents were mentioned, slight tensions in his jaw when specific dates came up. At the end of the day, Caldwell sauntered out of the courtroom, pausing at the door. Don't worry too much about this case, Judge, he called back. I'm sure we can come to an understanding. The implied threat hung heavily in the air as Carter gathered his papers, thinking of the note in his robe, of Elena's worried expression, and of all the lives ruined by Caldwell's greed. The path ahead would be fraught with peril, but Carter had spent his life preparing for cases like this. Later that night, in his modest home study, Carter reviewed the day's transcripts. His wife, Michelle, brought him a cup of tea, her presence a quiet comfort. Tough case? She asked, though she already knew the answer. She had stood by his side through countless battles, from his days as a struggling law student to his appointment to the bench. Caldwell thinks he's above the law, Carter replied, sipping his tea. He's used to buying his way out of trouble, manipulating the system. The way he looked at me today, it was as though I was beneath him, as if my position meant nothing. Michelle squeezed his shoulder. Then show him what real justice looks like. Carter covered her hand with his, drawing strength from her support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he allowed himself to remember why he had chosen to become a judge in first place. Not for power or prestige, but to ensure that justice remained truly blind to wealth, influence, and yes, even race. As night deepened outside his window, Carter continued working, preparing for battles ahead. In his mind, he could already envision the forces aligning against him. Caldwell's money, corrupt police, manipulated media. But he had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. This case would be his greatest test yet. But Anthony had never been one to shy away from a confrontation. As he finally headed to bed, he thought of all the people relying on him to remain steadfast, The victims of Caldwell's schemes, the honest officers combating corruption, and the community that viewed him as a symbol of hope. Tomorrow would present new challenges, but tonight, Judge Carter slept soundly, secure in his purpose. The law was on his side, and in his courtroom, at least, justice would prevail. Early morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Judge Carter's chambers as he reviewed the events from the previous day. Caldwell's blatant disrespect had set a challenging tone for what promised to be a grueling trial. His contemplation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Victoria Holt strode into his chambers, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, designer heels clicking against a hardwood floor. Her reputation preceded her, a brilliant legal mind who had never lost a high-profile case, primarily because she excelled at finding loopholes instead of proving innocence. "Your Honor, I've filed several motions regarding the admissibility of evidence," she announced, placing a thick stack of papers on his desk. "We have serious concerns about the chain of custody for key documents." Carter picked up the first motion, scanning its contents. "Ms. Holt, you're challenging the admissibility of virtually every piece of evidence the prosecution has gathered." "With good reason," she replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We believe proper procedures weren't followed. Detective Whitman's apartment has already acknowledged mishandling several key items." Just then, Elena Cruz burst into the chambers, her face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, the whistleblower's testimony, all of it has vanished in the evidence locker," she exclaimed. "Detective Whitman claims it was an administrative error, but this is a third piece of evidence that has mysteriously disappeared this week." Victoria's smile widened. "Sounds like the prosecution needs to keep better track of their materials." Judge Carter raised his hand, silencing both women. "Ms. Holt, I will review your motions. Ms. Cruz, document the missing evidence and file a formal complaint. That will be all for now." After they left, Carter leaned back in his chair, connecting the dots. The anonymous note had warned him about evidence disappearing, and now it was happening, with Detective Whitman's fingerprints all over it. Across town, in Caldwell's opulent mansion, a different scene was unfolding. Alexander Caldwell lounged by his infinity pool, sipping expensive scotch while Detective James Whitman paced nervously on the marble tiles. "Relax, James," Caldwell drawled. "Everything is going according to plan. The evidence is gone, and that self-righteous judge can't do anything about it." Whitman wiped sweat from his forehead. "It's not that simple, Alex. Carter's not like the others. He's asking questions, demanding documentation. My guys are getting nervous." "That's why I pay you so well," Caldwell replied, reaching for a manila envelope stuffed with cash. "Another $100,000 to keep your department cooperative. And James, make sure our friend from accounting doesn't make it to the witness stand." Neither man noticed a discreet security camera capturing their interaction, its red light blinking silently in the shadow of a palm tree. Back in the courtroom, the power struggle intensified. Victoria Holt filed motion after motion, each designed to stall proceedings and wear down the prosecution. Judge Carter maintained his composure, methodically addressing each challenge while ensuring the trial progressed. Caldwell's behavior grew increasingly provocative. He arrived late each day, barely acknowledging the court's authority. During testimony, he ostentatiously checked his phone or whispered loudly to his attorneys. Each small act of defiance tested Carter's patience, but the judge refused to take the bait. "Mr. Caldwell," Carter finally addressed him during an afternoon session, "your continuous disregard for court procedures is noted. Should this behavior persist, you will be held in contempt." Caldwell glanced up from his phone, smirking. "My apologies, Your Honor. Sometimes I forget who's supposed to be in charge here." The gallery tensed at the implied insult, but Carter simply continued with the proceedings, his dignity intact. That evening, Elena Cruz waited in a dimly lit parking garage, anxiously checking her watch. Her star witness, Thomas Bradford, had agreed to meet her secretly after receiving threats at his home. As footsteps echoed through the concrete structure, she turned to see Bradford approaching. His complexion was drained of color, reflecting his fear. "They were at my daughter's school today," he murmured, his hand trembling. Two officers just stood there, watching. They didn't intervene, they simply observed. His wife urged him to withdraw from the case. Elena felt her heart plummet. Bradford's testimony regarding Caldwell's offshore accounts was vital to their case. "Thomas, we can ensure your safety. The FBI has a witness protection program," she said urgently. He let out a bitter laugh. "The FBI?" Caldwell's eyes everywhere. "I'm sorry, Elena, but I can't jeopardize my family's safety." He turned and hurried away, leaving Elena alone with her deteriorating case. Meanwhile, Judge Carter was burning the midnight oil in his chambers, poring over case law for precedents that might assist him in navigating the obstacles that lay ahead. A gentle knock interrupted his focused research. "Come in," he called, expecting to see his clerk. Instead, a young police officer entered, cautiously shutting the door behind him. "Judge Carter, I'm Officer Michael Sullivan. I need to share something about Detective Whitman and Mr. Caldwell." Carter leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on." "Last week, I was assigned to the evidence room. I witnessed Detective Whitman remove files from the Caldwell case. He didn't adhere to the proper protocols and didn't sign anything out. When I questioned him, he claimed it was for special handling. I reported this to Internal Affairs, but nothing was done." "Why are you telling me this, Officer Sullivan?" "Because my father was a judge," Sullivan replied. "He instilled in me that justice is more important than politics. I can't provide proof, but I thought it was essential for you to know." After Sullivan departed, Carter discovered another anonymous note resting on his desk. "Check the offshore accounts. The truth lies within the numbers." The following morning, Victoria Holt initiated her most aggressive offensive yet, filing a motion to suppress all evidence pertaining to Caldwell's financial records. "Your Honor," she argued, "the prosecution acquired these records through questionable means. Their warrant was excessively broad, and the search exceeded its authorized scope." Elena Cruz sprang to her feet. "That's ridiculous. The warrant was executed properly, and everything was documented. At least it was before evidence started disappearing mysteriously." "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making baseless accusations." "Enough." Carter's voice sliced through the argument. "Ms. Holt, your motion is denied. The warrant was valid, and the evidence was properly obtained. Ms. Cruz, unless you have proof of evidence tampering, keep such allegations out of my courtroom." During the lunch recess, Caldwell appeared on a local news program, skillfully playing the victim. "This trial is a farce," he declared. "Judge Carter clearly has a personal agenda. How can anyone expect fairness from a judge who seems more focused on social justice than actual justice?" The interview ignited heated debates about judicial bias and race, exactly as Caldwell had intended. Some commentators defended Carter's integrity, while others questioned his ability to remain impartial given his background. That afternoon, Elena Cruz experienced a breakthrough when a junior accountant from Caldwell Enterprises stepped forward with documents revealing suspicious transfers to offshore accounts. However, before she could secure the evidence, the accountant was arrested by Whitman's officers on dubious drug charges. "This is spiraling out of control," Elena informed Judge Carter after hours. "Every time we make headway, the police intervene. It feels like we're battling a ghost. We can't prove they're working for Caldwell, but everyone knows it's true." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Keep building your case, Miss Cruz. Document everything. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when we least expect it." As if to validate his point, a new piece of evidence emerged that evening. A thumb drive appeared in Carter's chambers, containing photographs of Detective Whitman accepting envelopes from Caldwell at various locations. The source remained unclear, but the implications were undeniable. Across town, Caldwell hosted an extravagant party at his mansion, celebrating what he believed to be his impending victory. The city's elite mingled around his pool, sipping champagne and discussing the trial as if it were merely an inconvenient business affair. Anthony Carter is about to learn a harsh lesson about how things really operate in this city, Caldwell told his guests, raising his glass in a mock toast. By the time this trial concludes, he'll wish he had never heard my name. However, Caldwell's confidence was misplaced. In a quiet corner of the city, Officer Sullivan met secretly with FBI agents, sharing his knowledge about the corruption within the police department. In her office, Elena Cruz uncovered a pattern in Caldwell's financial records that would prove crucial in the days to come. The next morning, Judge Carter arrived at the courthouse early, preparing for another day of legal skirmishes. As he reviewed the contents of the mysterious thumb drive, he reflected on the forces aligned against him. Caldwell's wealth, the corrupt police, and the manipulated media, all working to obstruct justice. But Carter had faced insurmountable odds before. Growing up in the South Side of Chicago, he fought his way through law school and battled systemic racism throughout his career. Each challenge had equipped him for this moment. A noise in the corridor caught his attention. Through his partially open door, he glimpsed Detective Whitman engaged in a heated conversation with Victoria Holt. Their whispered words were inaudible, but their furtive glances told their own story. Carter smiled slightly, recalling something his mother used to say, "The truth is like water, always finds a way to flow." Caldwell's empire of corruption was beginning to show signs of weakness, and the water was starting to seep through. As the courtroom filled for another day of proceedings, Carter noticed a change in Elena Cruz's demeanor. She carried herself with renewed confidence, organizing her papers with purpose. She caught his eye briefly, offering a subtle nod that suggested she had discovered something significant. Caldwell arrived right on time for once, but his usual smugness seemed forced. Victoria Holt whispered urgently in his ear as he took his seat, and his expression darkened at whatever news she shared. Carter called the court to order, ready for the next round in this high-stakes battle for justice. The power struggle was far from over, but the tide was beginning to shift. Sometimes, he reflected, the most significant victories come not from dramatic confrontations, but from the patient accumulation of truth. As he prepared to commence the proceedings, Carter thought of Officer Sullivan's bravery, Elena Cruz's determination, and all the honest individuals fighting against corruption in their own ways. They were all part of a larger struggle, not just for justice in this case, but for the very soul of the justice system itself. The morning sun streamed through the courtroom windows, illuminating the scales of justice mounted on the wall behind Carter's bench. In their perfect balance, he saw a reminder of what they were all fighting for, a system where truth mattered more than money, where justice triumphed over power. Looking at Caldwell's arrogant face, Carter allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The businessman believed he held all the power, but had made a critical mistake. He had underestimated the strength of those who fought for justice not out of greed or ambition, but from genuine conviction. The battle was far from over, but as Carter called the court to order, he knew that truth and justice would ultimately prevail. It was merely a matter of time. The tension in courtroom 237 had reached a fever pitch by the third week of the trial. Recent revelations concerning police corruption and evidence tampering had created an atmosphere thick with anticipation. Judge Carter's steady gaze swept across the gallery as Margaret Wilson, Caldwell's former accountant, took the stand. Margaret sat rigidly in the witness box, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Despite the threats she had received in the patrol car that had followed her children to school yesterday, she had chosen to testify. 20 years of witnessing Caldwell destroy lives had finally overcome her fear. "How long did you work as head accountant for Caldwell Enterprises?" Elena Cruz began. 17 years, Margaret replied, her voice gaining strength. "I oversaw all financial operations, including Mr. Caldwell's personal accounts." "And during that time, what irregularities did you observe?" Victoria Holt sprang to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This calls for speculation." "Overruled," Carter replied calmly. "The witness's direct observations are relevant." "Continue, Ms. Wilson." Margaret took a deep breath. "It started with minor discrepancies, money moving between accounts in ways that didn't make sense. Then I discovered the offshore accounts, dozens of them, hidden under shell companies. Mr. Caldwell was siphoning funds from pension plans, community development projects, even children's charities." Caldwell's facade of indifference began to crack slightly. His jaw tightened as Margaret detailed the elaborate network of fraudulent transactions he had orchestrated. Elena methodically guided her through years of financial records, painting a damning portrait of systemic theft and corruption. "The worst part," Margaret continued, her voice trembling, "was seeing where the money was supposed to go. Senior Senator had to shut down affordable housing projects that were never built Scholarship funds have vanished. Mr. Caldwell would laugh about it during board meetings, calling it creative accounting. As Margaret spoke, Detective Whitman slipped into the courtroom, taking a seat near the back. His presence did not go unnoticed by Judge Carter, who observed a subtle exchange of glances between the police chief and Caldwell. That evening, Margaret returned home to find her house in disarray. Her front door hung off its hinges, furniture was overturned, and papers were scattered everywhere. Her hands shook as she called Elena Cruz. "They took everything," she whispered into the phone. "All my backup documents, my computer, even my children's laptops. The police say it was probably random burglars." "Stay where you are," Elena instructed. "I'm calling the FBI." Across town, Detective Whitman sat in Caldwell's study, sharing a glass of expensive bourbon. "It's handled," he reported. "Wilson won't have any evidence to support her claims now." Caldwell swirled his drink thoughtfully. "Good, but she's still a problem. People might believe her even without proof. Make sure she understands the consequences of continued cooperation with the prosecution. Already taken care of. My guys will drive by her kids' school again tomorrow, maybe follow them to soccer practice." Neither man noticed a silent figure in the darkened hallway, recording their conversation on a phone. The next morning, Elena Cruz confronted Whitman in the courthouse corridor. "You're not even trying to hide it anymore, are you?" she demanded. "Breaking into a witness's home and threatening children. Is there any line you won't cross?" Whitman smiled coldly. "Careful, counselor. Making accusations against law enforcement is a serious matter. Besides, I heard Ms. Wilson's neighborhood has had several break-ins lately. Maybe she should invest in better security." Judge Carter observed this exchange from his chamber doorway, his expression grave. The corruption was becoming increasingly brazen, but he needed hard evidence to take action. The anonymous notes and surveillance photos helped paint the picture, but they weren't sufficient for court. As Carter reviewed the day's motions, his clerk announced an unexpected visitor. "She says her name is CLA Caldwell, Your Honor." The woman who entered his chambers carried herself with the same confidence as her brother, but there was a different quality to her demeanor, less arrogance, more determination. Her designer clothes couldn't conceal the tension in her shoulders or the shadows under her eyes. "Judge Carter," she began without preamble, "I'm the one who's been sending you the notes and photos. I have something you need to see." She placed a laptop on his desk and played a video of Caldwell and Whitman's conversation from the previous night. The quality was impeccable, the audio crystal clear. Carter watched in silence as Caldwell explicitly ordered the intimidation of Margaret Wilson. "Why are you doing this?" Carter asked when the video ended. "Why turn against your own brother?" CLA's laugh held no humor. "Because Alexander stopped being my brother long ago. He became something else, something cruel and corrupt. I watched him destroy lives, break laws, and hurt people, all while believing his money made him untouchable." She pulled out a flash drive. "This contains years of evidence, recordings, documents, photos. I've been gathering it since he forced our father out of the company and drove him to—" She paused, composing herself. "Let's just say I have my reasons." "Ms. Caldwell," Carter said carefully, "if this evidence was obtained illegally, everything was recorded on my property or in spaces where I had legal rights to be. I've had lawyers verify it. It's all admissible. I'm tired of watching Alexander hurt people. Judge Carter, it's time someone stood up to him." When CLA's evidence was introduced in court the next day, the reaction was immediate. Victoria Holt launched into a passionate argument about family vendettas and illegal surveillance. Caldwell himself lost his carefully maintained composure, shouting that his sister was a vindictive liar who had always been jealous of his success. Amidst the turmoil, Ms. Holt asserted, "The evidence was obtained lawfully, Mr. Caldwell. Control your emotions or face contempt charges." Elena Cruz meticulously presented CLA's evidence, commencing with the video that depicted Caldwell instructing the intimidation of Wilson. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as his true character was exposed, his casual cruelty and unwavering belief in his own immunity. "He believes he is above the law," Claire later testified. "He once told me that justice is merely another commodity to be bought and sold. The only distinction between him and ordinary criminals, he claimed, was that he could afford a more sophisticated class of crime. As Claire spoke, Carter observed Caldwell scribbling something on a legal pad. He discreetly passed it to Victoria Holt, who read it with a frown before requesting a brief recess. Carter granted her request, watching Caldwell's legal team huddle for an urgent discussion. Upon their return, Victoria Holt's approach shifted dramatically. Rather than attacking CLA's credibility, she began to lay the groundwork for what seemed to be an insanity defense. She questioned CLA about their family history and their father's death, insinuating that Caldwell's behavior stemmed from profound psychological trauma. Objection! Elena Cruz interjected. Counsel is testifying. These inquiries regarding Mr. Caldwell's childhood are irrelevant to financial crimes he is accused of. Sustained, Carter ruled. Ms. Holt, stick to pertinent lines of questioning. The afternoon brought yet another surprise when a janitor from Caldwell Enterprises, David Martinez, came forward with additional evidence. He revealed that while cleaning Caldwell's office late one night, he stumbled upon documents detailing payoffs to police officers, judges, and city officials. However, before Martinez could take the stand, he was arrested on supposed outstanding warrants. This is absurd. Elena protested. These warrants suddenly appear on the day he is set to testify? Whitman shrugged nonchalantly. The law is the law, counselor. Mr. Martinez should have resolved his legal issues before volunteering to be a witness. The message was unmistakable. Caldwell's influence extended far and wide, and anyone who dared to challenge him would face severe repercussions. Back in the courtroom, Claire's testimony continued to dismantle her brother's carefully crafted facade. She recounted how he had systematically corrupted police officers, starting with minor favors and escalating to outright bribes. She detailed how he had used blackmail and threats to silence his adversaries, laughing about owning half the city's officials. "The Alexander you see in court," she told the captivated gallery, "with his expensive suits and polite smiles, that's not the real him. The true Alexander is the one who bankrupted our father's oldest friend because that man refused to sell his company. He's the one who celebrated when he learned that a witness against him had died in a random mugging." With each revelation, Caldwell's mask slipped further away. His habitual smirk transformed into a scowl, and his previously confident posture became rigid with rage when Claire described his reaction to their father's death. He finally erupted. "You treacherous traitor," he shouted, rising from his seat. "Do you think you can turn my own family against me? I made this family what it is. I built an empire while you pretended to be Daddy's perfect little girl." "Mr. Caldwell," Carter's voice boomed like thunder, "one more outburst, and you will be removed from this courtroom. Is that understood?" The gallery buzzed with shocked whispers. This was a genuine Alexander Caldwell. Not the suave businessman who had entered the court 3 weeks prior, but a man enraged at being challenged, accustomed to wielding absolute power. Seizing the opportunity, Elena Cruz produced records that corroborated CLA's testimony. Bank statements indicating payments to police officers, emails discussing witness intimidation, and security footage of meetings with corrupt officials. "The prosecution calls Detective James Whitman," Elena announced. Whitman took the stand, outwardly calm yet glistening with sweat on his forehead. As Elena questioned him about his relationship with Caldwell, his responses grew increasingly evasive. "Detective Whitman," Elena pressed, "how you explain the regular deposits of $50,000 into your Cayman Islands account?" "I know nothing about that account," Whitman replied stiffly. Elena produced the bank records. "These deposits coincide precisely with key evidence disappearing from police custody and cases related to Caldwell. Just a coincidence." Before Whitman could respond, his phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it surreptitiously, but Judge Carter noticed a movement. "Detective Whitman," Carter said firmly, "surrender your phone to the bailiff." The message from Caldwell was damning. "Keep your mouth shut. I'll handle everything." As the day's session concluded, Carter realized they had reached a pivotal moment. Caldwell's true nature had been unveiled, but like a cornered animal, this made him more dangerous than ever. In his chambers that evening, Carter reviewed CLA's evidence while Elena Cruz updated him on David Martinez's situation. They were interrupted by another anonymous note, this one containing a single line. Watch the recording. It hinted at one final piece of evidence, something so damaging that even CLA was afraid to reveal it. Whatever it was, Carter suspected it would shatter Caldwell's empire once and for all. As night enveloped the city, different players in this drama prepared for the impending events. CLA Caldwell sat in a safe house, guarded by FBI agents, reviewing years of accumulated evidence. Elena Cruz worked late into the night, constructing an airtight case around the new revelations. Detective Whitman paced his office, contemplating whether it was time to save himself by turning against his benefactor. Meanwhile, Alexander Caldwell stood at the window of his mansion, watching storm clouds gather over the city he once believed he owned. His perfectly manicured hand clenched around a glass of scotch as he made a phone call, one that would set in motion events shocking even to those who thought they had seen his darkest side. The stage was set for an explosive confrontation, but as Judge Carter had learned throughout his years on the bench, the most dangerous moment in any battle for justice is when victory seems within reach. The morning dawned gray and restless, mirroring the atmosphere in courtroom 237. CLA Caldwell sat at the prosecution table beside Elena Cruz, her posture rigid with determination. The gallery whispered in anticipation. Everyone had heard rumors about the recording she intended to present today. Alexander Caldwell entered with his usual arrogance, but those who looked closely could see the cracks in his facade. His silk tie was slightly askew, and his eyes bore the shadows of sleepless nights. Victoria Holt followed closely, clutching a stack of motions intended to prevent CLA's evidence from being heard. "Your Honor," Victoria began as soon as Judge Carter took his seat, "we move to suppress any recordings Ms. Caldwell plans to present. They were obtained through duplicitous means and represent a clear violation of Mr. Caldwell's privacy rights." Elena Cruz rose to counter. "Ms. Caldwell recorded these conversations in common areas of their family estate, where she maintains partial ownership. The recordings are completely legal and highly relevant to establishing Mr. Caldwell's pattern of criminal behavior." Judge Carter studied both attorneys before responding. "Ms. Holt, your motion is denied. The recordings were legally obtained in areas where Ms. Caldwell had standing rights of access. We will proceed." CLA approached the witness stand, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She carried a small laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. "This recording was made 3 months ago in our family estate's library. Alexander was meeting with Detective Whitman and several other officers to discuss handling potential witnesses in this case." The video began playing through the courtroom's audio system. The image showed Caldwell's library, adorned with dark wood and leather-bound books. Caldwell sat behind an antique desk, while Detective Whitman and 3 other officers stood before him like subservient aides receiving orders. "I don't care what it takes." Caldwell's voice resonated clearly through the speakers. "Nobody testifies against me. Use whatever means necessary, intimidation, arrest, accidents, if you have to. I'm paying you enough to handle this." One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, some of what you're suggesting is exactly why I own half the department." Caldwell interrupted him. "Don't develop a conscience now, Officer Roberts. Remember who paid for your mother's cancer treatments." The courtroom remained eerily quiet as the recording continued. Caldwell detailed plans to suppress evidence, intimidate witnesses, and obstruct justice. He named judges he had bribed, officials he had bought, and rivals he had destroyed. Each word further eroded his carefully constructed image of respectability. Then came the moment that changed everything. On the recording, Caldwell received a phone call. His expression darkened as he listened, then erupted in rage. "What do you mean Johnson won't back down? He's just a worthless janitor. Fine. If he wants to play the hero, make it look like a robbery gone wrong, just like we did with that nosy reporter last year." Victoria Holt's face went pale. The robbery of investigative reporter Michael Foster had been headline news, a supposedly random act of violence that had left him in a coma. Now, Caldwell had just confessed to orchestrating it. "Your Honor," Victoria stammered, "we request a brief recess to confer with our client." "Denied," Carter replied firmly. "The recording will continue." As the video played on, Caldwell's expression morphed from shock to fury, then to something resembling fear. He watched as his sister unveiled the evidence she had spent years gathering, proving not just financial crimes, but a pattern of violence and corruption that spanned decades. Elena Cruz methodically entered each piece of evidence into the record. Bank statements showing payments to corrupt officers, emails discussing witness intimidation, and surveillance photos of meetings with officials who had mysteriously changed their votes on regulatory matters affecting Caldwell Enterprises. Ms. Caldwell, Elena asked, "Why did you wait so long to come forward with this evidence?" CLA's eyes met her brother's across the courtroom. "Because I needed to be certain. Each time I thought I had enough proof, I discovered something worse. Alexander didn't just break laws. He believed they didn't apply to him. He saw himself as above the entire system of justice." Throughout her testimony, more revelations emerged. Caldwell had engineered the bankruptcy of a children's hospital to acquire the land for a luxury development. He had threatened the families of journalists who attempted to investigate him. He had even orchestrated accidents for employees who showed too much interest in his accounting practices. Detective Whitman sat in the gallery, his face ashen as years of corruption were laid bare. When CLA played a recording of him accepting bribes and discussing witness intimidation, he stood abruptly and exited the courtroom. Judge Carter noted his departure with interest. During a brief recess, Elena Cruz discovered a hidden ledger in Caldwell's corporate office documenting years of payoffs to police officials. However, before she could secure it, a mysterious fire broke out in the records room. The sprinkler system activated just in time to save most of the documents, but the ledger was severely damaged. "This is becoming dangerous," Elena informed Judge Carter in his chambers. "First, the break-in at Margaret Wilson's home, and now this fire. Caldwell is getting desperate." Carter nodded gravely. "Double security on all evidence. And Ms. Cruz, be cautious. Men like Caldwell are most dangerous when they feel cornered." Back in court, Victoria Holt launched a desperate counterattack, questioning the authenticity of CLA's recordings. She brought in audio experts who suggested the files might have been altered, though they could not prove it. "Your Honor," Victoria argued, "these recordings could easily have been manipulated by someone with a grudge against my client. Ms. Caldwell's own testimony reveals her bias against her brother." "Objection." Elena stood. "The defense is attempting to discredit evidence they know is authentic. We have chain of custody documentation for every recording." "Sustained," Carter ruled. "Ms. Holt, unless you have concrete evidence of tampering, move on." Outside the courthouse, public pressure mounted. Protesters gathered daily, demanding justice and police reform. News outlets provided constant coverage of the trial, with commentators dissecting every revelation. Some of Caldwell's former associates began distancing themselves, sensing which way the wind was blowing. The afternoon brought yet another shock when Officer Michael Sullivan took the stand. The young officer detailed years of witnessing corruption within the department, including specific instances of evidence tampering in Caldwell-related cases. Detective Whitman had a system, Sullivan testified. Certain evidence would be marked for special handling, meaning it would disappear or be altered before trial. Everyone knew what was happening, but nobody dared to speak up. As Sullivan testified, Elena noticed one of the jurors looking increasingly uncomfortable. The juror passed a note to the bailiff, requesting to speak with Judge Carter in chambers. Carter called both attorneys to join them. The juror, a middle-aged teacher named Sarah Bennett, was trembling. "Someone left photos of my children in my mailbox," she revealed, her voice quivering. Their school schedules were attached, along with a message that read, "Make the right decision or else." Carter immediately ordered additional security for all jurors and their families. The fact that Caldwell would dare tamper with the jury demonstrated his desperation and his continued belief that he could control the system. That evening, Detective Whitman made a pivotal decision. He walked into the FBI field office and requested to speak with agents about Alexander Caldwell. After years of serving as Caldwell's fixer, he had finally realized he was just another pawn in the billionaire's game. The next morning, Victoria Holt arrived in court without her client. "Your Honor, Mr. Caldwell is indisposed," she explained carefully. "Indisposed?" Carter's voice carried a dangerous edge. "This is a federal trial, Ms. Holt, not a social engagement. Where is your client?" Before she could respond, FBI agents entered the courtroom. "Mr. Caldwell has been apprehended," one of them announced. While attempting to board a private jet headed to a country that does not permit extradition, the lead agent declared, "He is being brought here now." When Caldwell finally arrived, flanked by agents, his transformation was complete. The polished businessman who had strutted into court weeks earlier was gone, replaced by a man unraveling under the weight of his own arrogance. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his silver hair was disheveled. "Mr. Caldwell," Judge Carter addressed him, "would you care to explain why you attempted to flee the jurisdiction?" Caldwell's reply dripped with venom. "This entire trial is a sham. My own sister, my flesh and blood, is conspiring with this judge who believes he can take down someone like me." "Someone like you?" Carter repeated quietly, probing for clarity. The gallery held its breath, anticipating whether Caldwell would finally articulate the unspoken truth. Instead, he turned to his sister, his face contorted with pure hatred. "You have always been envious, always the good daughter, the moral one. Well, look where that morality has led us. Our father is dead and forgotten. I built something substantial. I made our name mean something." Claire's voice trembled with emotion as she responded. "You made our name synonymous with corruption and cruelty. Alexander. Dad died because you destroyed him. I'm doing this because someone must stop you before you inflict harm on anyone else." The day's final blow came when Detective Whitman's FBI interview was entered into evidence. He detailed years of corruption, naming individuals and providing specific dates. The intricate web of criminality centered on Caldwell, but extended throughout the power structure of the city. Elena Cruz's closing argument was impassioned yet measured. She meticulously laid out the evidence, illustrating not only financial crimes, but also a systematic assault on justice itself. Caldwell had not merely broken laws. He had attempted to dismantle the entire system that upheld them. In contrast, Victoria Holt's closing remarks fell hollow. She spoke of reasonable doubt and circumstantial evidence, but her heart was not in it. She had seen the same recordings as everyone else and had heard her client's own words reveal his true nature. As the jury retired to deliberate, Judge Carter observed Caldwell being led back to custody. The earlier swagger of the businessman had vanished, replaced by the cautious movement of a man who finally understood he was no longer in control. That evening in his chambers, Carter reflected on the trial's strange journey. What had begun as a case of financial crimes had unearthed something far more sinister, a cancer of corruption that had nearly consumed the city's justice system. Elena Cruz knocked on his door, carrying fresh coffee and a weary smile. "The jury's been out for 3 hours," she reported. "But after everything they've seen and heard..." Carter nodded. Both understood that in this case, justice was not merely about one man's guilt or innocence. It was about demonstrating that the system could still function, that truth could prevail over power and wealth. Outside his window, the protesters remained, their candles flickering in the gathering dusk. Their signs called for justice, reform, and change. Thanks to CLA's courage and the dedication of individuals like Elena Cruz and Officer Sullivan, they might actually see it. The next morning would bring the verdict, but the real victory had already been secured. Caldwell's true nature had been exposed and his network of corruption unveiled. Regardless of the jury's decision, nothing would ever be quite the same. The morning news hit. Like a thunderbolt, every major network ran the story. Judge Carter was accused of racial bias and misconduct. Detective Whitman had orchestrated a masterful smear campaign, leaking carefully edited court transcripts and out-of-context quotes that painted Carter as a judge harboring a personal vendetta against successful white defendants. Judge Carter watched the coverage from his office, his expression unchanged. The headline scrolling across the screen read, "Sources question Judge Carter's fitness to preside over high-profile Caldwell case." "They're desperate," Elena Cruz said, standing in his doorway. This is what Caldwell does when he's losing. He attacks the integrity of the entire system. Before Carter could respond, his phone buzzed. The text message was simple. "Your grandson Tommy enjoys his little league games. It would be a shame if something happened during practice today." Attached was a photo of Tommy in his baseball uniform, clearly taken that morning. Carter's hands tightened around the phone. In 20 years on the bench, no one had dared threaten his family. He immediately called his daughter Sharon, instructing her to pick Tommy up from school and take him to a secure location. Then he reached out to the FBI. Meanwhile, across town, CLA Caldwell was collaborating with federal agents in a secure room, methodically reviewing decades of financial records. Her second ledger, hidden away years prior, contained details of payments to law enforcement officers that made the first one appear tame by comparison. "Look at this," she pointed to an entry. $500,000 to Chief Inspector Williams, day to day before he abruptly dropped the investigation into that suspicious fire at the children's hospital site. Elena Cruz leaned in, scrutinizing the numbers. And these regular payments to Judge Reynolds? Isn't he the one who dismissed 3 separate lawsuits against Caldwell Enterprises last year? Alexander didn't just buy individual officers, Claire explained. He purchased entire departments, judges, regulatory officials, anyone who could potentially obstruct his path. Back in the courthouse, Victoria Hope filed an emergency motion to disqualify Judge Carter from the case, citing the morning's news stories as evidence of bias. Carter listened to her arguments with the same patient attention he had demonstrated throughout the trial. "Ms. Holt," he said when she finished, "your motion is denied. These accusations are clearly a reaction to yesterday's revelations. This court will not be intimidated by attempts at character assassination." Victoria's practiced composure slipped slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, public confidence in your impartiality has been compromised. The appearance of bias alone is damaging, just like the evidence that keeps disappearing from police custody," Carter interjected, "just like the sudden problems your client opponents always seem to encounter. The motion is denied." As Victoria returned to her seat, a commotion erupted in the gallery. One of the jurors, Michael Pierce, had collapsed, clutching his chest. The court medical officer rushed to his aid, but it was evident that something was seriously wrong. Hours later, toxicology reports revealed that Pierce had been poisoned, a clear message to the other jurors. Carter immediately ordered the entire jury to be sequestered under federal protection, but the damage to their sense of security had already been done. That evening, Judge Carter sat in his study at home, reviewing case law on jury intimidation. A shadow moved across his window. He reached for his phone, but before he could call security, a brick crashed through the glass, missing his head by mere inches. Attached to it was a note, "Even federal judges bleed." The next morning, Elena Cruz arrived at the courthouse early, determined to press their advantage despite the escalating threats. She found her office door ajar, papers scattered across the floor. Someone had broken in during the night. However, in their haste to find something incriminating, they had left behind a crucial piece of evidence, a single police-issue glove. "They're getting sloppy," Elena told Carter, displaying the glove in an evidence bag. "Desperation makes people careless." Carter nodded, but his mind was preoccupied with the mounting pressure on his family. His wife, Michelle, had noticed cars following her to work. His daughter, Sharon, reported strangers photographing Tommy at school. Even his elderly mother had received suspicious visits from police officers asking questions about her son. During the morning session, Claire took the stand again, this time revealing the full extent of her brother's retaliation against witnesses. She described how Caldwell's network of corrupt officers would manufacture evidence, plant drugs, or create false arrest records for anyone who dared to speak out against him. It wasn't just intimidation, Claire testified. Alexander believed in completely destroying people. He'd take their jobs, their reputations, their freedom, anything to maintain his power. Victoria Holt's cross-examination turned vicious. "Isn't it true, Miss Caldwell, that you were passed over to lead Caldwell Enterprises? That your brother's success has always gnawed at you?" "Success?" Claire's voice cracked with emotion. "Is that what you call it when he drove our father to suicide? When he bankrupted families and destroyed lives? When he had people attacked or killed because they threatened his empire?" The gallery gasped at this last revelation. Victoria quickly tried to move to strike, but the words hung in the air like smoke. During the lunch recess, One of the remaining jurors, Patricia Williams, requested to speak with Judge Carter in chambers. With both attorneys present, she revealed that someone had approached her teenage daughter, offering a full college scholarship in exchange for a not guilty vote. "I want to do the right thing," Patricia said, tears welling in her eyes. "But my daughter's future." Carter leaned forward. "Ms. Williams, I need you to listen carefully. What they're offering isn't a scholarship. It's a bribe. Your daughter's future will be better served by seeing her mother stand up to corruption than by accepting blood money." Patricia straightened in her chair, nodding firmly. The attempt to bribe her had backfired, strengthening her resolve instead of weakening it. The afternoon brought a breakthrough that changed everything. Elena Cruz discovered a pattern in the offshore accounts that proved Caldwell had been laundering money for years through a network of seemingly legitimate charities. The money trail led directly to high-ranking political figures who had consistently blocked investigations into Caldwell Enterprises. However, just as Elena prepared to present this evidence, a suspicious fire broke out in the records room of her office building. The sprinkler system activated quickly, but not before several key documents were damaged. It was the latest in a series of convenient accidents that had plagued the prosecution. Detective Whitman, growing increasingly desperate, made his final play. He leaked documents to the press suggesting that Judge Carter had accepted bribes early in his career. The story was entirely fabricated, yet several news outlets ran with it before verifying the sources. Carter watched the story spread across social media, knowing that even when proven false, the accusations would leave a lasting stain. It was a calculated move. If they couldn't defeat him legally, they would destroy his reputation. The judge's response came not in words, but in action. He signed orders allowing federal agents to seize records from the police department's evidence room, effectively removing Whitman's ability to manipulate evidence. He also authorized a special task force to investigate the pattern of witness intimidation. That night, as Carter worked late in his chambers, he received an unexpected visit from Officer Sullivan. The young policeman looked nervous but determined. "Judge, there's something you need to know," Sullivan began. "Detective Whitman is planning something big. I overheard him on the phone with someone, talking about making sure you get the message once and for all." Carter studied the young officer. "Are you willing to testify to this?" "Yes, sir. I joined the force to protect people, not to help criminals escape justice. Whatever happens, I'm done being part of this corruption." As Sullivan left, Carter reflected on how this case had evolved. What had started as a trial for financial crimes had exposed a vast network of corruption that reached into every corner of the city's power structure. The real question was not whether Caldwell was guilty, but how many others would fall alongside him. Elena Cruz arrived early the next morning, her face tense with new concerns. "Your Honor, we have a problem. The janitor who tried to testify, David Martinez, he's disappeared. His family says he never came home last night." Carter immediately contacted the FBI, but everyone understood what this meant. Caldwell's people were eliminating loose ends, silencing potential witnesses before they could expose the full extent of the corruption in court. Victoria Holt appeared increasingly uncomfortable with her role in the proceedings. The evidence of her client's crimes had become too overwhelming to ignore, and the tactics being employed to obstruct justice were growing more violent. During a heated exchange about missing evidence, Victoria faltered in her defense. "Your Honor, while my client maintains his innocence, I must express concern about certain actions taken by parties unknown." Caldwell shot her a warning look, but Victoria continued, "The integrity of the legal process must be preserved regardless of—" "M. Holt!" Caldwell cut in sharply. "I need to speak with you now." During their whispered conference, Carter observed the dynamic between them. Victoria's body language revealed an increasing resistance to her client's demands, while Caldwell's barely contained rage was evident in his clenched jaw and trembling hands. The afternoon brought yet another anonymous threat to Carter's family, this one accompanied by detailed information. Regarding his wife's daily routine, the message was unmistakable. "Step back, or those you cherish will suffer the consequences." However, Carter had dedicated his life to combating intimidation and injustice. Each threat only fortified his determination to see this case through to its conclusion, to ensure that no one, regardless of their wealth or influence, could ever consider themselves above the law. As day transitioned into evening, Carter received news that David Martinez had been located, shaken but alive. The would-be kidnappers had fled upon the arrival of federal agents, leaving behind evidence that would further implicate Detective Whitman and his corrupt associates. In his chambers that night, Carter reviewed the day's events with Elena Cruz, reflecting on the escalating threats, the attempt to tamper with witnesses, and the frantic smear campaigns, all of which pointed to a corruption network that was beginning to implode. "They're becoming reckless," Elena noted, observing their mistakes. "The question is, how many more individuals will they harm before this concludes?" Carter's response was interrupted when his clerk, Sarah, rushed in with breaking news. Detective Whitman had been caught on camera receiving a briefcase filled with cash from one of Caldwell's associates. The footage was already circulating widely on social media. "The house of cards is collapsing," Carter mused, "but cornered animals are the most perilous." Tomorrow would be pivotal. As he prepared to leave for the night, Carter discovered one last note on his desk. Unlike the others, this one offered a glimmer of hope. "Not all cops are corrupt. Some of us remember our oath. Keep pushing. The truth is emerging." The judge smiled faintly as he gathered his papers. Tomorrow would present new challenges, fresh threats, and renewed attempts to derail justice. Yet the momentum had shifted. The corruption that had seemed untouchable was beginning to disintegrate, exposed to the illuminating light of truth. While driving home through the dimly lit city streets, Carter reflected on all the individuals who had risked everything to confront Caldwell's corruption. Claire, with her meticulously gathered evidence. Elena, with her relentless pursuit of justice. Officer Sullivan, with his courageous testimony. And countless others who had refused to be silenced. The truth was emerging piece by piece, and no amount of threats or intimidation could halt its progress. The only remaining question was how many more secrets would be uncovered before the full extent of the corruption was ultimately revealed. The courthouse buzzed with anxious energy as David Martinez was escorted into Judge Carter's chambers by federal agents. The janitor's clothing was wrinkled, his face drawn with fatigue, yet his eyes burned with determination. After 3 days of being held captive in an abandoned warehouse, he was ready to share his story. Elena Cruz sat beside him, recorder in hand, as he recounted his ordeal. They wore masks, but I recognized Detective Whitman's voice. They kept asking what evidence I had and what I planned to testify about. When I refused to speak, his hand trembled as he touched the bruises on his face. Judge Carter leaned forward. "Mr. Martinez, no one would blame you for choosing to walk away after what you've been through. Are you absolutely certain you want to testify?" "My father was a janitor, too," Martinez replied, straightening in his chair. "He taught me that a man's integrity is worth more than his life. I have watched Mr. Caldwell destroy lives for years. Someone must speak the truth." When Martinez took the stand an hour later, the courtroom fell silent. He testified about years of overheard conversations and discovered documents, painting a picture of corruption that extended far beyond mere financial crimes. He described how Caldwell would hold court in his office late at night, meeting with police officials, judges, and politicians who came to receive their bribes and instructions. The night before the children's hospital mysteriously burned down, Martinez revealed, "I was cleaning near Mr. Caldwell's office. I overheard him on the phone, laughing about how much money he would make from the insurance payout and the land development. He said sometimes progress requires sacrifice. Victoria Holt's cross-examination was lackluster at best. The security footage of her client celebrating the hospital fire had already been submitted as evidence through Claire's testimony. Each question she posed only seemed to reinforce Martinez's credibility. During the lunch recess, Detective Whitman made a critical error. Panicked by Martinez's testimony, he attempted to break into the federal evidence lockup, where Claire's recordings were stored. The FBI agents who apprehended him discovered a thumb drive containing falsified evidence intended to discredit Judge Carter, along with a list of witnesses marked for special handling. The afternoon session brought another bombshell as Margaret Wilson returned to the stand. The former accountant had spent weeks reconstructing her documentation of Caldwell's financial crimes, working from copies she had wisely stored in multiple locations. It wasn't just money laundering, she testified, projecting spreadsheets onto the courtroom screen. Mr. Caldwell created a complex network of shell companies to conceal his illegal activities. Each company served a specific purpose: bribing officials, funding criminal operations, or hiding stolen assets. As Margaret detailed the flow of money, Caldwell's composed facade cracked further. He whispered furiously to Victoria Holt, who shook her head in response. Their disagreement escalated to the point where Judge Carter had to call for order. "Ms. Holt," Carter addressed the defense attorney, "do you require a moment with your client?" "No, Your Honor," Victoria replied, slightly distancing herself from Caldwell. "My client and I seem to have a fundamental disagreement regarding trial strategy." The implications of her statement hung in the air. Victoria Holt, known for defending wealthy clients regardless of their guilt, appeared to be distancing herself from Caldwell's increasingly desperate tactics. Elena Cruz seized a moment to introduce new evidence: a series of offshore bank statements revealing millions in payments to various shell companies. Each company's creation coincided with a major criminal operation: the hospital fire, the reporter's attack, the evidence tampering. "The money tells a story," Elena explained to the jury. "Every time Mr. Caldwell needed something illegal accomplished, a new shell company would emerge. The funds would flow through multiple accounts to obscure their origin, but they always led back to Caldwell Enterprises." During her presentation, a commotion erupted in the gallery as federal agents arrested Judge Malcolm Reynolds, one of the judges Caldwell had repeatedly bribed to dismiss cases against him. Reynolds had made the mistake of attempting to contact a juror's family member. Caldwell watched the arrest with growing agitation. His usual smirk had been replaced by a nervous tick in his jaw. The sight of his allies being taken down one by one clearly unnerved him. Claire Caldwell took the stand again, this time armed with years of surveillance footage from the family estate. "Alexander installed cameras everywhere," she explained. "He was paranoid about his own security, but he never considered that I might access the footage." The video displayed a parade of corrupt officials entering and leaving Caldwell's study, each one departing with an envelope or briefcase. Some footage showed Caldwell explicitly discussing illegal operations, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and even plans for the hospital fire. "This footage," Claire continued, her voice steady, "reveals my brother for who he truly is, not a successful businessman, but criminal who built his empire on corruption and human suffering." Caldwell finally erupted. "You treacherous!" he shouted, rising from his seat. "I gave you everything: a life of luxury, the best education, connections to power. This is how you repay me." "You gave me nothing but shame," Claire replied calmly. "Every luxury was paid for with someone else's pain. Every connection was built on corruption. I'm doing this because someone must stop you." Judge Carter's gavel cracked through the air. "Mr. Caldwell, control yourself or you will be removed from this courtroom." "Miss Caldwell, please continue." The afternoon ushered in a series of rapid developments. The FBI arrested 3 more police officers linked to witness intimidation, and an anonymous source leaked emails revealing Caldwell's direct involvement in jury tampering attempts. Victoria Holt was seen entering the federal building, presumably to discuss a potential plea deal. Elena Cruz stepped up to display more evidence on the courtroom screens. These documents illustrate how Mr. Caldwell systematically corrupted our city's institutions. Every department, every agency that should have stopped him was compromised. He didn't just break the law. He attempted to dismantle the entire system of justice. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions flowing to corrupt officials. Surveillance footage captured countless illegal meetings, and witness testimony painted a picture of absolute corruption and casual cruelty. "Your Honor," Victoria Holt suddenly interrupted, standing. "May I approach the bench?" In a whispered conference with Carter and Elena Cruz, Victoria made a stunning revelation. "My client attempted to bribe me this morning to fabricate evidence against Judge Carter. I have recordings of the conversation." Caldwell, watching the discussion, seemed to deflate in his chair. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him, and even his own attorney had turned against him. The next witness surprised everyone. Thomas Bradford, the whistleblower who had earlier been intimidated into silence, returned to testify. Federal protection had given him the courage to speak out. Mr. Caldwell didn't just steal money, Bradford testified. He stole people's futures. Pension funds emptied, retirement savings wiped out, entire communities devastated. And he laughed about it. He referred to his victims as necessary casualties of progress. As Bradford spoke, Elena Cruz noticed one of the jurors wiping away tears. The human cost of Caldwell's crimes was finally becoming evident to everyone in the courtroom. The day's final revelation came from an unexpected source. A young officer from the evidence room stepped forward with security footage showing Detective Whitman removing and destroying evidence. The officer had kept a secret copy, waiting for the right moment to expose the corruption. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," the officer testified. "Seeing Mr. Martinez stand up to them gave me courage. We're supposed to protect people, not help criminals escape justice." Judge Carter concluded the day's session with a clear sense that justice was finally prevailing. The intricate web of corruption Caldwell had spent decades constructing was unraveling thread by thread. In his chambers that evening, Carter reviewed the day's developments with Elena Cruz. Caldwell's empire was built on intimidation and fear, he observed. Once people find the courage to speak out, it begins to collapse. Elena nodded, sorting through the mountain of evidence on his desk. "It's like a dam breaking. Each new revelation encourages more people to come forward. The question is, how many more surprises are we in for?" The answer came sooner than expected. Late that night, Victoria Holt contacted the FBI with information about a hidden vault in Caldwell's mansion. Inside, agents discovered decades' worth of blackmail material, photos, videos, and documents that Caldwell had used to control his network of corrupt officials. The next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by news vans and protesters. The public had finally glimpsed Caldwell's true nature, and they were demanding justice. Signs reading "No one is above the law" and "End corruption" filled the streets. Inside the courtroom, Caldwell's transformation was complete. Gone was the arrogant businessman who had refused to stand for Judge Carter. In his place sat a desperate man, watching his life's work dissolve into nothing. Elena Cruz's presentation continued methodically, laying out years of criminal activity. Each piece of evidence connected to others, building an unassailable picture of corruption and cruelty. "The prosecution would like to play one final recording," Elena announced. This was recovered from Mr. Caldwell's private vault last night. The audio recording captured Caldwell in his office, openly discussing his disdain for the law. Justice is merely another commodity. His voice echoed through the courtroom. Everything has a price. Every man can be bought. The trick is finding their weakness and exploiting it. Victoria Holt rose slowly. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, I request a brief recess to discuss options with my client." Judge Carter studied the defense attorney's face, understanding the implications. "Granted. We will reconvene in 1 hour." As federal agents led Caldwell from the courtroom, he turned to his sister one last time. "You think this is justice?" he sneered. "You've destroyed our family's legacy." "No, Alexander," Claire replied softly. "You did that yourself. I'm just ensuring the truth comes out." The truth was indeed emerging in ways no one had anticipated. Each passing hour brought new revelations as more individuals found the courage to speak up. Caldwell's empire of corruption was collapsing like a house of cards in a fierce wind. Judge Carter observed it all from his bench, maintaining his judicial composure while inwardly celebrating each victory for justice. The system wasn't perfect, but today it was functioning precisely as it should. As the sun set over the courthouse, casting long shadows to the high windows, Carter knew that tomorrow would bring the final act. In this unfolding drama, Caldwell's destiny was on the brink of being determined, yet his impending downfall had already achieved something extraordinary. It demonstrated that no individual, regardless of their wealth or influence, could genuinely consider themselves above the law. A heavy silence enveloped courtroom 237 as the jury entered after 6 hours of deliberation, having arrived at their verdict. Judge Carter scrutinized their expressions. Some displayed relief, others determination, but all bore the gravity of the decision they were about to announce. Alexander Caldwell sat at the defense table, his expensive suit now creased and rumpled, his silver hair unkempt. Despite his disordered appearance, an air of arrogance continued to emanate from his rigid posture. Beside him, Victoria Holt maintained a professional distance, having failed to persuade her client to accept the prosecution's last-minute plea deal. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Carter inquired, his deep voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. The foreperson, Patricia Williams, the same juror who had rebuffed Caldwell's attempt to sway her vote with a college scholarship, stood up. "We have, Your Honor." Elena Cruz gripped the edge of the prosecution table, her knuckles turning white. Months of hard work, countless threats, and numerous hurdles had culminated in this moment. Beside her, Claire Caldwell remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on her brother. "On the charge of tax fraud in the first degree, how you find?" "Guilty," came the reply, and a murmur rippled through the gallery. "On the charge of embezzlement?" "Guilty." "On the charge of money laundering?" "Guilty." As the litany of guilty verdicts continued, Caldwell's facade finally shattered. His face twisted with rage as he comprehended the full extent of his defeat. 27 counts, 27 guilty verdicts. His empire of corruption was officially in ruins. "You can't do this to me." Caldwell snarled, rising from his chair. "I own this city. I've purchased better judges than you." "This isn't over," he shouted defiantly. "Remove the defendant," Carter ordered, his voice slicing through Caldwell's tirade as federal marshals moved to handcuff him. Caldwell lunged toward his sister, shouting, "You treacherous! Do you think this makes you righteous? You're nothing but a jealous." The marshals restrained him before he could reach Claire, who stood unfazed, watching with sorrowful eyes as her brother was dragged from the courtroom, still hurling threats and obscenities. Outside the courthouse, the news spread rapidly, and crowds of protesters erupted in cheers. Many were victims of Caldwell's schemes. Retired teachers whose pensions he had pilfered, families who had lost their homes to his fraudulent development projects, and former employees he had ruined. Back inside, Judge Carter addressed the remaining members of the courtroom. "The defendant will be remanded to federal custody pending sentencing. I want to express my gratitude to the jury for their service and bravery in the face of unprecedented intimidation attempts." As the jury filed out under federal protection, Elena Cruz began gathering her materials. The victory felt surreal after weeks of threats, evidence tampering, and corruption. She caught Judge Carter's eye and saw her own relief mirrored there. The fallout came swiftly. Within hours of the verdict, federal agents launched coordinated raids across the city. Detective Whitman was apprehended at his residence, where agents uncovered millions in cash and incriminating documents. Judge Reynolds was taken into custody while attempting to flee the country. By evening, the police department was in disarray, with officers loyal to Whitman being suspended or arrested, while honest cops who had been silenced for years finally felt liberated to speak out. The commissioner called an emergency press conference to announce a complete internal investigation. Claire Caldwell watched the news coverage from Judge Carter's chambers, where federal agents were taking her statement about years of witnessed corruption. "There's something you should know," she told Elena Cruz. Alexander made one last call before the verdict. I couldn't hear what he said, but he was smiling afterward. Elena's concern proved justified that night. As Judge Carter left courthouse, shots rang out in the parking garage. The judge dropped to the ground as a security detail returned fire. The would-be assassin, a former police officer on Caldwell's payroll, was wounded and captured. The attack only strengthened the resolve of those fighting against corruption. The following morning, honest officers within the department began coming forward in droves, sharing evidence they had hidden away out of fear of retaliation. Each new revelation expanded the scope of the investigation. "Your Honor," Elena said during an emergency meeting in Carter's chambers, "we've uncovered evidence of judicial corruption in at least 15 other states." Caldwell's network extended far beyond the city. Carter nodded grimly. "Contact the federal task force. This is bigger than any of us realized." As federal agents swarmed through Caldwell Enterprises' offices, they uncovered the true magnitude of his criminal empire. Hidden servers revealed decades' worth of blackmail material, proving corruption at every level of government. The legitimate businesses operated by the company had merely been a facade for a massive criminal organization. Seeing the writing on the wall, Victoria Hope began cooperating with prosecutors. She provided details about other wealthy clients who had employed similar tactics to subvert justice. Her testimony would eventually lead to dozens more investigations. In his holding cell, Caldwell received news of each fresh betrayal with mounting fury. His attempt to contact allies were thwarted. Most wouldn't take his calls anyway. Those who had once feared him now scrambled to save themselves by providing evidence against him. The media coverage was relentless. News channels ran constant updates about arrests and revelations. Journalists who had once been too afraid to investigate Caldwell now published exposés about his crimes. The public's appetite for justice seemed insatiable. 1 week after the verdict, Judge Carter sat in his chambers reviewing sentencing guidelines when his clerk brought in a letter. It was from Tommy, his grandson. "Dear Grandpa, Mom says you're a hero because you weren't scared of the bad man. I want to be brave like you when I grow up." Carter smiled, tucking the letter into his robe pocket. The threats to his family had been terrifying, but moments like this made the risk worthwhile. The city was transforming. With Caldwell's network exposed, corrupt officials were being ousted from power. Ordinary citizens felt emboldened to report wrongdoing, knowing they would finally be heard. A culture of accountability was gradually replacing one of fear and silence. Elena Cruz's office became a hub for whistleblowers and witnesses. People brought evidence of other corruption schemes, leading to new investigations. The dam had broken, and decades of suppressed truth were flooding out. Claire Caldwell established a foundation to assist victims of corporate fraud, using her share of the family fortune to provide restitution that courts couldn't mandate. The first beneficiaries were the families affected by the children's hospital fire. Detective Whitman, facing decades in prison, finally broke his silence. His detailed confession implicated dozens of other officers and officials, describing how Caldwell had systematically corrupted the department through a combination of bribes and blackmail. "He started small," Whitman testified. "Little favors, small payments. By the time you realized how deep you were, it was too late to get out. He owned you." The honest officers who had resisted corruption were finally vindicated. Michael Sullivan, the young officer who had first alerted Judge Carter about evidence tampering, was promoted to lead a new internal affairs unit dedicated to preventing future corruption. As the sentencing date approached, pressure mounted on Judge Carter. Caldwell's remaining allies launched a desperate media campaign, questioning the judge's impartiality. Anonymous threats continued to flood his office and home, but Carter remained steadfast. He had devoted his career to fighting for justice, and this case embodied everything he believed in. The system could work if individuals had the courage to stand up for what was right. The day before sentencing, Margaret Wilson visited Carter's chambers. The former accountant, whose testimony had helped expose Caldwell's financial crimes, wanted to share something. "We found more evidence in the backup servers," she explained. "Mr. Caldwell didn't just steal money. He deliberately targeted vulnerable communities. He called it social engineering, forcing people out of neighborhoods he wanted to develop by destroying their economic foundations." Carter added this information to his sentencing considerations. The human cost of Caldwell's crimes extended far beyond mere dollars and cents. He had systematically attacked society's most vulnerable members, viewing them as obstacles to be removed rather than individuals to be protected. That evening, Elena Cruz prepared her sentencing recommendation. The prosecution would seek maximum penalties on all counts, arguing that Caldwell's crimes represented an unprecedented assault on the justice system itself. Throughout the city, citizens gathered for candlelight vigils, sharing stories of how Caldwell's crimes had impacted their lives, finding solidarity in their shared struggle for justice. The case had become a symbol of hope, proof that even the most powerful could be held accountable. In his cell, Caldwell made one final attempt to regain control. He offered prosecutors evidence against even bigger targets in exchange for leniency, but his bargaining power had evaporated. The investigation he had ignited would continue with or without his cooperation. The morning of sentencing brought crowds to the courthouse steps. Signs demanded justice, but there was no anger in the demonstration, only quiet determination to see the process through. Inside, Carter prepared to deliver the most significant sentence of his career. He reviewed his notes one last time, contemplating all the lives Caldwell had damaged or destroyed. Justice demanded more than punishment. It required a clear message that no one was above the law. Claire sat in the gallery as her brother was let in, shackled and clad in prison orange instead of his customary tailored suits. Their eyes met briefly, decades of family history passing between them in a single glance. Elena Cruz sat at the prosecution table, her posture straight yet relaxed. She had fought hard for this moment, risking her career and safety to expose the truth. Now, justice would finally be served. Victoria Holt's seat at the defense table was occupied by a public defender. She had withdrawn from the case after providing evidence about Caldwell's attempt to fabricate evidence against Judge Carter. The gallery was packed with reporters, victims, and citizens who had followed the case. Every eye was fixed on Judge Carter as he prepared to announce a sentence that would conclude Alexander Caldwell's reign of corruption. Caldwell stood before the bench, his arrogance finally replaced by the uncertainty of a man facing consequences for the first time in his life. The moment of justice had arrived, and not all his money and power could halt it. 6 months after Alexander Caldwell's conviction, Judge Anthony Carter stood at his chamber window, observing the morning sun illuminate a transformed city. The ripples from the trial had spread far beyond their jurisdiction, sparking a nationwide movement for judicial reform and anti-corruption measures. His quiet reflection was interrupted by Elena Cruz, who arrived with fresh coffee and a stack of newspapers. "You've seen the headlines?" she asked, spreading them across his desk. Each one detailed new investigations spawned by the Caldwell case. "Federal task force uncovers corruption in 12 more states," Carter read aloud. "Supreme Court to review anti-corruption guidelines." They're calling it the Caldwell effect. How one case exposed the cracks in the entire system. Elena nodded, sipping her coffee. "The nomination committee is meeting today. Word is you're their top choice for the federal bench." Carter had been approached about the nomination weeks ago, but his mind was occupied with more immediate concerns. In an hour, he would deliver Caldwell's final sentence. The disgraced businessman's empire had been dismantled, his assets frozen, and his network of corruption exposed to daylight. The courthouse was packed as Carter took the bench. Caldwell sat at the defense table, thinner now after a month in custody, but still radiating defiance. His new public defender, the force since Victoria Holt's departure, appeared anxious. "Before we proceed with sentencing," Carter began, "Mr. Caldwell, you have the right to address this court. Do you wish to make a statement?" Caldwell stood slowly, his shackles clinking in the hushed courtroom. "You think this is justice," he sneered. "You've destroyed something you don't even comprehend. I brought progress to the city. I made things happen while bureaucrats merely talked. Yes, I broke your precious rules, because rules are for those who lack the vision to change the world." Carter let him finish, noting how even Caldwell's defiance had waned. The man who had once commanded a criminal empire now ranted like a petty tyrant, his words echoing hollowly in the courtroom. "Mr. Caldwell," Carter responded, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, "progress without justice is merely tyranny dressed in finer clothes. You speak of vision, but your only vision was one of personal power and profit. You didn't serve the city, you parasitized it." The judge lifted a document. Caldwell's final sentencing report. "This court sentences you to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, all assets derived from criminal activity will be seized and redistributed to your victims through a supervised restitution program." As federal marshals led Caldwell away, he turned to make one last threat. "This isn't over, Carter. I still have friends in high places." But those friends were already scrambling to save themselves. 3 state senators and a federal judge implicated in Caldwell's web of corruption were apprehended. The investigation had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Claire Caldwell observed her brother's sentencing from the gallery, her expression a mask of composed sorrow. Afterward, she convened with Elena Cruz to discuss the Victim Restitution Foundation she had established. "We have identified over 2,000 victims of Alexander's schemes," Claire explained, spreading documents across Elena's desk. "The foundation will ensure they receive compensation even beyond what the courts can mandate." Their meeting was interrupted by breaking news. Someone had attempted a break into Judge Carter's home. The intrusion had been thwarted by federal agents who arrested 2 former police officers still loyal to Detective Whitman. They never learn, Elena muttered as she watched the news coverage. Every attack just proves how desperately we need this change. The changes were indeed sweeping. Michael Sullivan, now heading the police department's anti-corruption unit, had implemented stringent new oversight protocols. Officers with ties to Caldwell were being systematically removed and replaced with carefully vetted recruits. David Martinez, the janitor whose testimony had helped expose Caldwell's crimes, had been hired as a compliance officer at Caldwell Enterprises, now under new management and renamed Phoenix Industries. His first act was to establish an anonymous whistleblower program. Margaret Wilson returned to her position as head accountant, this time with a mandate to create transparent financial systems. She worked closely with federal regulators to develop new protocols for detecting and preventing corporate fraud. The ripples of change spread beyond the city. Law schools began utilizing the Caldwell case to teach about systemic corruption, incorporating lessons about maintaining integrity under pressure. Judge Carter was increasingly invited to speak about judicial independence and the importance of ethical courage. One afternoon, Elena found Carter in his chambers, reviewing applications for a new judicial mentorship program aimed at finding the next generation of incorruptible judges. Something like that, he smiled. The Caldwell case showed us how fragile the system can be. We need individuals who understand that justice isn't merely about adhering to rules. It's about safeguarding the fundamental dignity of every person. Their conversation was interrupted by Carter's clerk bringing news about Detective Whitman. The former police chief had finally broken under pressure, offering evidence against corruption networks in other cities in exchange for consideration during sentencing. It never ends, Elena sighed. Each revelation leads to 10 more investigations. Good, Carter replied firmly. The truth should come out, no matter how uncomfortable it makes those in power. The truth was indeed emerging in ways that transformed the city's power structure. Citizens who had once felt powerless against corruption now had channels to report it. Community oversight boards were established for major institutions, and transparency became more than just a buzzword. Claire's Victim Restitution Foundation became a model for similar programs nationwide. She worked tirelessly to ensure that her brother's victims received not just compensation, but also a chance to rebuild their lives. It's not just about the money, she told a group of former Caldwell Enterprises employees. It's about restoring faith in the system, about demonstrating that justice can work for everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful. The media's attention eventually began to shift to new stories, but the impact of the Caldwell case continued to resonate. Other judges cited Carter's decisions in similar cases, and police departments across the country studied the investigation as a model for rooting out corruption. Tommy Carter, the judge's grandson, brought his entire class to tour the courthouse. "My grandpa showed that good guys can win," he proudly told his teacher. Carter, overhearing this, felt a renewed sense of purpose. The next generation needed to believe in justice. 1 year after sentencing, Carter sat in his chambers late one evening, reading letters from individuals impacted by the case, a mother whose daughter's college fund had been restored, a retired teacher who could finally access his pension, and a journalist who felt empowered to investigate corruption without fear. Elena Cruz knocked on his door, carrying a familiar coffee cup. "The Federal Nomination Committee is meeting again tomorrow," she reminded him. "Are you ready to move up to the next level?" Carter gestured toward the letters on his desk. "I've been contemplating that. The federal bench would be an honor, but there's still work to be done here. This city needs to understand that what we achieved wasn't merely about one case or one corrupt businessman. It was about transforming the entire system. Speaking of which, have you seen the latest numbers? Reports of corporate fraud are up 300% since the Caldwell case because people finally believe that reporting it will make a difference." Carter nodded. "That's the real victory. Not just punishing one man's crimes, but restoring faith in justice itself." Their discussion was interrupted by breaking news. Federal agents had just arrested a prominent CEO in another state using evidence that traced back to Caldwell's hidden records. The ripples continued to spread. Claire Caldwell's foundation announced its latest initiative, a program to support whistleblowers who expose corporate corruption. She named it after David Martinez, honoring the janitor's courage in speaking truth to power. Meanwhile, Alexander Caldwell faced additional charges as new evidence emerged. His attempts to run his criminal network from prison had been detected and shut down. Former allies refused to take his calls, fearing they would draw attention from investigators. Judge Carter's reforms began showing measurable results. Conviction rates in corruption cases rose significantly, and public trust in the justice system improved. Young lawyers and judges sought mentorship from those who had stood firm during the Caldwell case. The city itself was healing. Communities devastated by Caldwell's schemes were rebuilding. The Children's Hospital was reconstructed, this time with strict oversight of all funds. Phoenix Industries, under new leadership, became a model of corporate responsibility. Michael Sullivan's anti-corruption unit served as a template for other police departments, and he regularly consulted with federal agencies, sharing lessons learned from the Caldwell investigation. Margaret Wilson developed financial tracking systems that made it increasingly difficult to hide criminal proceeds. Her methods were adopted by regulatory agencies nationwide, creating a more robust defense against corporate fraud. Late one evening, Carter left his chambers to find Elena still at work, reviewing files from ongoing corruption investigations. "We've barely scratched the surface," she told him. "Each case leads to 3 more. It's like pulling threads from a sweater. The whole thing starts to unravel." "Then we keep pulling threads," Carter replied, "until the next generation inherits a system they can trust." As he drove home that night, Carter passed a renovated children's hospital. Its windows glowed warmly in the darkness, a symbol of renewal and hope. The Caldwell case had demonstrated that justice wasn't merely an ideal. It was a living force that required constant vigilance and courage to uphold. Tommy was waiting at home, eager to share what he'd learned in his civics class. "We talked about your case today, Grandpa, about how one person standing up for what's right can change everything." Carter hugged his grandson, reflecting on the legacy they were building. The Caldwell case hadn't just ended one man's corruption. It had ignited a movement for genuine systemic change. The next morning, Carter took his usual seat on the bench. The courtroom looked the same, but everything had changed. Where once corruption had bred fear and silence, now there was a growing culture of accountability and truth. As he prepared to hear the day's cases, Carter reflected on how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The fight for justice wasn't a single battle, but a constant commitment. The Caldwell case had illuminated the path. Now it was up to everyone to follow that course. Judge Anthony Carter proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't money or influence. It's a simple, unshakable belief that justice matters. What would you risk to stand up for what is right? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice, courage, and the moments that change everything. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on corruption and those brave enough to combat it. And remember, sometimes the most significant changes begin with the smallest stands.